Okay, Thomas. Tell me about the other half of the Patterson Gimlin film, Bob Gimlin.
Well, Bob Gimlin, his real name is Robert Gimlin, but we call him Bob. I've known and we have been good friends for over 25 years. And of course, as you know, Bob Gimlin was the man who was with Roger Patterson when he shot the famous film on October 20th, 1967. Quite frankly, Bob Gimlin was the one of the two who got the real good look at it. Because he stayed on his horse, and as he said over the years, Roger had to look through that horrible camera lens the whole time, whereas I was just looking at it with a plain eye. I've never known a more honest man, a more liked man in my life. And quite frankly, if this whole thing was a hoax, it was an absolute stroke of genius of Roger Patterson to bring honest Bob along his back out. Bob always told me he always thought there was something wrong with the film. They used Kodachrome 2 film in the camera that day, and he always thought there was something wrong with it, because what he saw with the naked eye was more of a teak color compared to the dark black gray image you see on the film.
Right.
And it was closer to the color you see on my walls here.
Yeah.
And he thought there was always something wrong with it. And he's always said, Thomas, there's no way you'll ever convince me that what I saw that day was a man in a suit, or some kind of hoax being pulled on us, or that Roger had something to do with pulling a hoax, because he doesn't believe he could fool him. And quite frankly, the way Bob Gimlin was treated, by Roger, but more or less from Roger's brother, Al Diatley, was basically financing all this. Gimlin was basically shut out of everything. He never got anything from the film. Roger Patterson did. He sold rights to it, Time Life magazine, things like that. And Al Diatley did. As a matter of fact, Al Diatley had Roger Patterson touring, and he hired an actor to pretend to be Bob Gimlin on the stage. So if anyone, after all this, had a good excuse to come out and say, this man faked this video, it was Bob Gimlin.
Yeah.
But to this day, he says, no, there's no way that Roger could have pulled that off over me. And he says, there's no way that someone could have pulled that off on both of us, and there's no way you'll ever convince me that what I saw that day wasn't a real flesh and blood animal.
And Bob was closer than Roger was.
At one point he was, yeah. As a matter of fact, he'd gone a few feet more
towards the animal.
Towards the animal. You would have seen him in the frames close to 352.
Right.
Because he maintained control of his horse. Roger was dehorsed at this point, and he ran across the creek up around the snake stick and went down and filmed those sequences that are so famous.
Yeah.
And Roger was just slightly ahead to his left on horse, and he had drawn his rifle, but he was still on horse.
Bob?
Bob. Bob Gimlin was still on his horse. He maintained control of his horse, and he just watched as it disappeared.
Right. And Bob pulled his rifle.
Yeah, he had his rifle out.
Because he said that he was worried that this thing might...
Yeah, he always said he and Roger had an agreement that unless they were attacked, they wouldn't shoot one. But he had his rifle drawn just in case.
That's right.
Yeah. And like I said, when we went there in 2003, my second trip down there, we took Bob with us.
Yeah.
And it was the first time Bob Gimlin had ever been back to the film site since that day.
Really?
And it had changed so much he couldn't recognize the darn thing. Because like I said, the film site is not a clearing anymore. It's filled with 30-foot second growth trees. And Bob couldn't even recognize the spot.
What were his comments, though?
He said, you know, it's a lot more remote today than it was back then. Because back then there was actually a little logging road right beside the creek that was even closed in 1967, but great stretches of it were still usable. Mm-hmm. It's actually the original road in 1958 where the Jerry Crew cast tracks were found a little further down, closer to the Klamath River.
Oh, yeah. That's where they were found.
Yeah, that's where they're found, that same road, when they were making it. But Bob said it's more remote and hard to get here today than it was back then, and he's right. And if you read the original story of how they got out of there when the rain started to fall, you can understand why it's more remote now than it was back then, because back then they had to go up a switchback to get down there. And they had a logging backhoe or something was left on site with the keys in it. They had to use that to pull the truck a truck with the horses in it up a hillside to get it over a bend or give it over a hump, because the road was going out. So they had a hell of a time getting out of there. And of course, Bob Gimlin was exhausted when they went into Murray's Field, I believe it was Murray's Field, to airship the film to Aldi Atley, who was waiting for it. Bob fell asleep in the truck because he was exhausted.
Right.
And he said, we used my truck, my gas, my horses, and I did all the driving. Because quite frankly, Roger drove like a maniac, and I didn't like him driving my truck.
Yeah. So Aldi Atley didn't finance it. Bob did. Really?
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Before, up to the evidence was achieved, right. And after that, then Aldi Atley sort of took over. Yeah. But again, one of the biggest reasons, assuming the Sasquatch does indeed exist, that the Patterson-Gimlin film actually shows a real Sasquatch, to my mind, is Bob Gimlin was there. Yeah.
And just to be clear, Thomas, Bob Gimlin at the time of the filming was already an experienced woodsman that had spent plenty of his time in the woods and would be able to tell the difference between a real animal and somebody in a suit.
I have no doubt about it.
Yeah.
I have no doubt about it.
Yeah.
He just, quite frankly, he said a few times he wished he shot it that day and all this would have been over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Thomas.
All right.